I've always loved abandoned places. There's just something exhilarating about walking through a place no one's supposed to go. It tells stories of a time long past. Maybe it's the silence or the sense of isolation that comes with being in a place the world has forgotten. I'm not really sure. But there's something special about it. Blackwood Hospital, though. That place was different. I first heard about it from a few guys on an urban exploration forum I frequent sometimes. It's good to keep in touch with the community. There were whispers, rumours about it being one of the most haunted places in the country, let alone the city. The hospital had been closed for over 50 years, shut down after some sort of scandal that no one seemed to know the full details of. Some said it was because of malpractice. Others whispered about the insane experiments conducted on the patients there. Either way, it had been locked up tight ever since. No one had managed, or dared, to breach it yet. It had become kind of a myth in its own right in the forum. All sorts of rumours flew around. People saying that the last people who had gone there hadn't come back out. That there was a ghost in there who roamed the empty halls. And even the occasional blood-curdling scream that could be heard at night from outside the gates. I didn't buy into it, at least, not entirely. Places like this always had ghost stories attached to them. But the prospect of getting in there, where no one had explored yet, that was too good to pass up. I spent weeks planning. The place was guarded pretty heavily. The city had a vested interest in keeping people out. The new mayor was all about safety and security. They must have heard about the increasing fame of the building. But thankfully, I found a gap in the patrols and figured out how to get over the fence. I even scoped out an entrance, a basement window that had been smashed open by some delinquent years ago. Everything was ready. I waited until a moonless night, figuring that my best shot was to move under cover of complete darkness. Armed with my flashlight, a camera and my phone, I scaled the fence at the perfect moment and dropped silently onto the other side. The hospital loomed before me. It felt almost menacing. It was huge, much bigger than I'd imagined. You can see pictures of things on the internet, but it can never get across just how big some things are. The building sprawled across several acres, and from where I stood, I could make out the skeletal remains of multiple wings and crumbling structures. Vines crawled up the stone walls, and shattered windows stared back at me. I hesitated for a moment. I'd explored big places before, but none like this. Something about it felt different. I shook off the feeling before long, and moved toward the basement window I'd found during my earlier scouting trips. It took a little effort, but I managed to pull myself carefully through the jagged opening, landing on the cold, tiled floor below. The air was thick with the scent of mould and dust, stale from decades of disuse. I cursed myself for not thinking to bring a face mask with me. I hoped that would be the worst of my problems. The basement was a maze of utility rooms, old storage areas, and dark, damp hallways. Most of the equipment had been stripped away over the years, but the occasional rusted stretcher or broken wheelchair remained, long forgotten. It didn't take long before I felt utterly disoriented. The place seemed to stretch on forever, and the deeper I went, the more I began to feel trapped. As I continued walking through a narrow corridor, I was careful to avoid the broken glass scattered on the floor as much as possible. The crunching of my feet echoed off the walls. I was just about to cross the threshold into a larger room at the end of the hallway when I heard a piercing, squeaking noise fill the air. Reflexively, I span around on the ball of my foot to look behind me. It looked identical, although I wasn't sure that a rusted wheelchair that I'd stepped past a moment ago wasn't in the same position. After staying frozen for a few seconds, I didn't see or hear anything. Just my imagination playing tricks on me, I thought. I continued on. I eventually found a staircase leading up. The metal steps creaked beneath my weight as I ascended, and I emerged into what looked like the main hospital building. The difference between the basement and the upper floors was striking. Here, the decay was more apparent. The paint on the walls was peeling in long strips, and there were huge holes in the plaster. Broken windows were letting in a chill from outside, along with the rhythmic patter of the heavy rain. I walked slowly, taking it all in, snapping a few pictures with my phone. The silence was striking. Every sound I made seemed to reverberate unnaturally, as if the walls were amplifying even the smallest noise. After a short while of walking around in awe, I found what appeared to be an old nurse's station, with overturned chairs and scattered papers littering the floor. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, clearly untouched by human hands for years. It was amazing to see a place that just used paper. There weren't any computers at all. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up a few papers from the floor to look at. I shone my flashlight on them and scanned through, but to my disappointment, there was nothing that interesting. Just drug dosage and doctor's notes. They must have used a typewriter to produce these. The typeface was pleasingly retro. Just as I was coming to the end of the last note, something clattered onto the floor behind me. A pen rolled slowly between my feet. That's odd. It must have fallen off the nurse's station, but I didn't touch the station at all. Again, I brushed the thought off quickly. As I crouched to pick up the pen, I felt a draft run along the floor. To be expected, considering the number of broken windows in the place. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I straightened up, turning the pen over in my hand. It wasn't just any pen. It was pristine, clean, like it had just been dropped minutes ago. That was impossible. The room was covered in dust. It clearly hadn't been touched for years. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the pen. Then, the silence around me was broken by a faint noise. A soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My eyes opened wide. Slowly, I turned towards the source of the sound. Down the hallway, barely visible in the weak light of my flashlight, something moved in the shadows. I couldn't quite make it out. Was it an animal? Might be a fox looking for food, although I'd find nothing here. As I strained my eyes to see, I saw something that didn't seem to make sense. The object was solid, but seemed darker than the shadows around it, and it was getting closer. I instinctively stepped backwards, nearly tripping over my own feet. The shadow continued to move, and now I could hear it more clearly. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The soft drag of something heavy along the floor. I ducked down behind the nurse's station, hoping that they hadn't seen me. Someone must have had the same idea as me. Just my luck for this to happen. I waited with bated breath to to see if they were heading in my direction. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder. Panic set in. I didn't dare move. One other thought popped into my head. Could it be the police? Possible. I didn't want to stick around to find out. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence returned. This silence had a weight to it though. I couldn't hear the rain anymore. Couldn't even hear my own breathing. It was like the world around me had gone still, like time itself had paused. And then, from the end of the hallway, a voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. "Help me," the words echoed, bouncing off the walls, growing louder with each repetition. "Help me." I backed up, nearly tripping over a fallen chair as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever was down the hallway. My flashlight flickered again, plunging me into momentary darkness. And in that split second, I heard it. A loud, metallic crash, like something slamming into the wall. The light managed to flicker back on, and I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, partially obscured by shadow. It was hunched over, its limbs long and twisted, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The gown it wore was filthy, covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood. And then it moved. Not walking, jerking forward in quick, unnatural bursts, like its body was being pulled by invisible strings. Each movement was accompanied by a sickening crack, the sound of bones snapping and joints popping. "Help me," the voice said again, but this time it was right next to me. I screamed. Then, as if my legs were acting independently of me, I turned and ran. I sprinted down the hallway, the flashlight beam bobbing violently as I fled. I darted around a corner, slamming into the wall, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of here. My mind raced, trying to remember the way back to the basement, to the window I'd crawled through. But the hospital was labyrinthine, and in my panic, I couldn't tell one hallway from the next. They all looked the same. I threw open a door at random and stumbled into another room. A large open space that must have been some kind of operating theatre from what I could see. Rows of rusted metal chairs lined the perimeter, facing a decaying surgical table in the centre. The walls were covered in old medical diagrams and faded posters. I ran to the far corner of the room, my back against the wall, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I pointed it toward the door. I was begging for it to keep walking past. The footsteps stopped just outside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for whatever was out there to come through the door. I waited, and then nothing. I thought, hoped, that maybe, just maybe, it had lost track of me. Then, the door creaked open, just a few inches. I could barely make out the shape of the figure standing in the hallway, its shadow spilling into the room. It lingered there for a moment, unmoving, as if it were deciding whether to come inside. "Help me," the voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't pleading. It was almost mocking. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room plunged into complete darkness. My flashlight flickered, sputtered, and then died, leaving me alone in the pitch-black room. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I swiped the screen to activate the flashlight app. I don't know how on earth I managed to do it. The dim glow of the phone illuminated the room. Standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, was the figure. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were wide, glowing faintly in the dark, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. It had long, bony claws for fingers. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared at me, its smile growing wider, impossibly wide, as if it were enjoying my fear. I backed up, away from the inhuman thing in front of me. I felt the cold metal of a double door with the palms of my hands. My hands were still shaking horribly, but I slowly fumbled around looking for a handle, with my eyes still locked onto whatever this was. With the smile now reaching across its whole face, with rotten teeth jutting out from odd angles, it arched backwards. Its hands now touched the floor, as it was now standing on all fours. It was a hideous sight. My breath quickened in panic. As if I were watching a spider, it then quickly scuttled along the floor, up the wall, and was now upside down on the ceiling. I let out an involuntary scream. I'd never seen anything that disturbing as long as I'd lived. To my relief, my right hand found the metal handle. Without thought, I yanked down with my full body weight. The door gave way behind me with a groaning creak, and I crashed onto the floor, my flashlight and phone skidding across the ground. It winded me for a second, and I found myself gasping for breath. But I had no time to waste. I scrambled frantically to my feet, my hands slipping on the dusty floor. I darted forward to snatch up my phone, its faint light glowing from across the room. But I didn't bother picking up the flashlight. I didn't have time. I could hear the skittering of claws on metal from above me. Rapid, erratic, like a creature scrambling for its prey. It was still on the ceiling. I looked up. It was staring directly down at me. Its head twisted at an unnatural angle, and its wide, hollow eyes bore into mine. It started moving. It felt completely alien, as if a spider from another dimension. I backed into the hallway, still gasping for air, and slammed the door shut behind me with a loud bang. My heart pounded as I fumbled to lock the door, but there was no lock, just a flimsy, rusted handle. It wouldn't hold for long. I jammed a splintered piece of wood into it, better than nothing. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. As I ran, I could hear the door behind me creak open, and a loud crash echoed down the corridor. It was after me. Up ahead, I spotted a flicker of light. The stairwell. The staircase I'd come up earlier. I bolted towards it, my feet slipping on the damp, cracked tiles, but I managed to reach them. I grabbed the railing, pulling myself up as fast as I could, taking the steps 2 at a time. Behind me, the sound of claws on metal returned. It was gaining on me. I raced up the stairs, my legs screaming in protest, and when I reached the next floor, I threw myself against the heavy door and pushed it open with all of my strength. I knew where I was now, just a little further. The window. I could see the faint light from outside, the broken window I'd used to sneak in. Despite my body's cries to the contrary, I sprinted as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't dare look back, but behind me, I could hear its rattling breathing now as it scuttled up the stairs, its claws scraping against the walls and the floor. But I was so close to getting out. I reached the window, grabbed the ledge, and hoisted myself up. But I didn't have the luxury of time now, so I ignored the jagged edges of glass that bit into my palms. Blood ran down my hands in rivers, but I didn't care. I was running on pure adrenaline. I didn't feel any pain. I swung one leg out of the window, and then the other, my feet finally touching the wet concrete outside. I was out. I was free. I turned, just for a second, to look back at the window. The creature was there, crouched in the frame, its twisted face pressed against the shattered glass. It still grinned, that terrible grin. I wasn't sure if it was able to leave this place, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could across the hospital grounds, not daring to look back again. I could hear the distant sound of the creature's laughter, low, rasping, and full of malice, echoing in my ears as I scrambled over the fence and collapsed onto the street. The rain poured down on me, but I didn't care. I was out. I was safe. I allowed myself a few moments to collect myself, but I struggled to my feet and staggered home. It was the longest 2-mile walk I've ever experienced. My body was racked with pain for the entirety, but I had to warn them. I had to warn everyone. Leaving bright red stains on the keys of my keyboard, I typed out a frantic post on the forum. Warning: do not enter Blackwood. I didn't type much, but I didn't need to. All I needed to say was, this thing lives here. Do not go inside. As I fell backwards through the door in the operating theatre with my phone in hand, I must have taken a picture of the ceiling by accident before it flew out of my hand. There, blurry but visible, was the monster. Its eyes glowed, and a long black tongue could be seen lolling out of its wide grin. Most believed me. A few praised my photo editing skills and said that this was a good ghost story. Regardless, I didn't hear about anyone trying to enter the hospital again after that. I'd hoped that this was true. It was also possible that someone had not been so lucky as me. I guess I'd never know. By a stroke of luck, the building was scheduled for demolition just a few months after that night. The mayor wanted to make room for a new apartment block. I don't know what happened to that thing, but I prayed that whatever was buried beneath the rubble stayed buried. The day of the demolition arrived, and I watched from a safe distance. A crowd gathered around, eager to see the end of Blackwood Hospital. The walls crumbled, and with every blast, I felt a weight lifting off of my chest. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. As the dust settled, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another notification from the forum. But instead, there was a single message. No sender, no number. Just 2 words. Help me.